Chapter 2, Environmental Sustainability and Human Values. Remember again that it's how we use the earth that is important, rather than just how many of us there are. So we go back to that idea of sustainability. And as we continue to occupy this planet, and there are more of us, we need to continue to be aware of growing sustainably or developing in a sustainable fashion. We have to consider how economic growth will impact the needs of us today without affecting our ability to meet the needs of future generations. We have to also look at the environmental decisions we make, making sound environmental decisions, and making socially equitable decisions to make all of these three legs come together to truly be sustainable. And it can only occur within the limits of the environment. Remember in the previous chapter, we looked at the ecological footprint. It's much greater in the developed countries than it is in the developing countries. But if worldwide our average footprint is 1.5 Earths, we don't have 1.5 Earths, we've got one Earth. So we have to live within what this one Earth can provide for us sustainably. Again, we can't sustain the amount of consumption that occurs in the highly developed countries like the US, much of Europe, Japan, Australia. We have to, as a world, live within the means of our Earth. It's not about the number of people, it's about our consumption, as we talked about in Chapter 1. The affluent lifestyle that has developed in the more developed countries in turn leads to more pollution and more environmental degradation than the lifestyle of those developing countries, where those people largely still live off the land. Sustainable consumption, then, your book defines as a balance between improving our quality of life, providing us with all the things that we have grown accustomed to having, but still reducing the actual consumption of resources. So using less resources, recycling more resources, using renewable instead of non-renewable resources are all components to solve that puzzle. And this can be summarized as an idea called voluntary simplicity. It means that we need to get away from thinking that our quality of life is based on the amount of stuff we own. It really isn't. Our society has made it that way. Commercials, the whole consumptive society that we live in has made it seem that way. You have to have the latest iPhone, you have to have the latest Droid, you got to have the biggest possible TV, you got to have a computer that's no more than 2 years old. And what do we do with those things when we get rid of them? Most of them still work, but they get thrown away or sent off somewhere else so we don't have to have them anymore. We've got to get away from that mode of thinking. It's not going to be easy. Decades now we've been sort of trained by our society that if we aren't using the latest greatest technology, then we're a loser. It has to be a behavioral change in our thought process, which means every one of us individually have to be committed to making that change. We can't rely on somebody else to do it. I don't recycle, it's too much of a hassle, but I know my neighbors do, so they're taking care of it for me. You can't think that way. We have to look at the bigger picture of things like the values and character that defines us as individual people. And again, not basing that value of us on what we own. If anything, it should be based on how well we utilize the resources and how well we are preserving the environment around us. Probably among all of the things that we value are our automobiles. We like the freedom of having our own car, being able to go anywhere we want, whenever we want to go there. We don't like having to wait for a bus or depend on the bus schedule that may or may not go where we want, when we want to go there. Places like Reading have, some decent transportation, but it's not certainly like a larger city would have. So there are some limits, obviously, but how can we solve that? Well, we as the people have to push our politicians to make those changes and probably be willing to pay for it by taxes that we already seem to think we pay too much of, and I understand that. But we can't solve the problems without input, whether it's money or effort or time. Technological advances continue to help promote us as being more willing to voluntary simplicity. One thing that we probably, most of us have done to some degree is switching from the old incandescent light bulbs to the modern compact fluorescent or even the newer LED light bulbs. Some people haven't. Well, they're more expensive, which they are, but they last a lot longer. And then when they do burn out, you still have to throw them away. But unlike the old light bulbs, the compact fluorescents and LEDs have to be disposed of properly. And that might involve some money or at least time taking those to the proper kind of place. So a lot of us add too much hassle. I'll just stick to the cheap light bulbs and replace them when they burn out. The new light bulbs save us money. They're cheaper to operate. They last longer. And they are one little step that each of us can do behaviorally to change the way we use resources. Part of this process also is to look at ourselves and look at ethics. Ethics with respect to how we utilize the environment. Ethics is a branch of philosophy that deals with our human values and morality. My program actually teaches a course called Environmental Ethics. It's a general education class that fits in the multicultural living skills area. And we basically talk about the moral basis of environmental responsibility. We have to consider the rights of people living today, but we also very importantly have to consider the rights of future generations, leaving the planet in a little better condition than we got it in, so the next generation can build on that and make it a little better and a little better in the future. This is critical for us because our actions today affect not only the future, but our actions affect everybody on the planet today. It never used to be, when there weren't many people on this planet, that something that a group or a culture could do would affect everybody on the planet. But that's not true today. Things that we do in the United States affect Europe. Things that people in Europe do affect China. Things that people in China do affect North America. It's truly global in all ways of defining the word global. We have to look at what our role is in the future of the planet we live on and the future of the resources that we depend on. And again, it's a cultural thing, but it's also very much an individual thing that each of us have to consider. So there are various worldviews, as your book puts it, where we look at the personal perspective of different people based on the different values they have. So the first one is the environmental worldview that in theory helps us make sense of the world around us. It helps us determine what is right and wrong from a behavioral standpoint. Despite the name, it's not always compatible with truly being sustainable, but it is based on how the environment works and how we as humans fit into it. And then we look at the Western and deep ecology worldviews, where they're sort of opposite, and then some versions of these views are much more extreme. So the two main worldviews are the Western worldview and the deep ecology worldview. The Western worldview, referring to Western societies, like the developed countries, are based on the fact that we as humans are superior to nature. One of the ideas, the reasons why we settled this country was well, things like religious freedom. But when we landed here, we basically were reading the Bible, and in the very first chapter of the Bible, in book of the Bible, in Genesis, it talks about how God told us to subdue nature, that we have dominion over the birds and the fish on the earth. And so people took that very literal, that the earth was simply put here for our use, that we were led to this new country by God to use the resources to benefit us. And so basically that gave us this idea of totally unrestricted use of our natural resources. We can cut all the trees down on this mountain, but there's another mountain next over the next hill. And if we cut all those trees down, well, there's another group of trees over the next hill. And this is, again, consistent with this frontier attitude that we had of exploiting all of the resources that were in front of us, just because that's sort of what we're meant to do. We did it with forests, we did it with wildlife, we've been doing it with minerals like gold or other metals that we depend on. We're doing it with water, we're doing it with our atmosphere. We really haven't changed that frontier attitude to some degrees. Compare that to the deep ecology worldview that's based on harmony and respect for nature. Now, again, I would argue that the Western worldview is a pretty broad generalization. There are certainly a lot of people in the United States that believe we should be in harmony with nature, that while we need wood for products, we should replant the trees after we cut them down. So keep in mind, these are just two really broad perspectives, but certainly within them there are going to be different individual perspectives. I guess the key thing about the deep ecology worldview is really, in my mind, that the idea that all living things have equal worth. That butterfly has just as much a right to live on this planet as we do. That bug in the middle of the tropical rainforest that none of us will ever see has just as much of a right to continue living as we as humans do. So in other words, we should protect the planet just for the sake of all the living things on the planet, because they were here before we were. And as you can see on the slide, there's a variety of people that subscribe to the deep ecology worldview. So again, in the deep ecology worldview, all organisms have an intrinsic value just to be here on the planet. And it's not based on how they provide us with resources. Things that provide us with value, like timber species of trees, have no more or no less value, again, than that butterfly living in the tropical rainforest. And so this is also considered to be a biocentric viewpoint, focused on living things, not just humans, but all living things. Compared to the Western worldview, where organisms that have value to us as humans have more value in general, and things that don't really provide us with any benefit, they don't have any value in curing disease or providing food or resources for building, have less value to us as humans. So this is referred to as an anthropocentric viewpoint, focused on humans, not just focused on all living things. But as with everything out there in the world, when there are opposing viewpoints, there will be people that are extremely off to one side or the other, and it should always be our goal to conserve, use wisely, that's a key thing, conserve human life and non-human life. So where we can find a common interest between world Western views and the deep ecology view, where we can find some overlap, that should be the goal. We provide living things a place to live. We use things that we need for our own survival, but we try and find a balance between those two things. That's really the key for us to be sustainable on this planet. So again, embracing the deep ecology worldview that all forms of life are equal, we also have to consider that humans have an obligation to all other living things on this planet, and I wholeheartedly agree with that. We also have to remember that we're very much connected with nature. 200 years ago, we were all very much connected with nature because we had to be. It was up to each one of us to find enough food to feed our family, to build our own home, to grow our own food, to do everything we needed to do to survive. And it was directly related to us living in nature. With most of us now worldwide living in cities, we lose that connection with nature. And it's important for us to get that back. I said earlier that it isn't exactly about how many people are on the planet, it's about how they use resources, and that's true. But we also have to kind of realize that the more of us there are, the more resources we do use. And so the human population coming into balance with the environment is something that's going to have to be addressed. Right now, remember, the developed countries are only 20% of the world's population, but we use 75 or 80% of the resources. What happens when all of those other developing countries become developed? Do you think they're not going to do what the rest of the developed countries did? So if now the whole world is consuming at the rate that countries like the United States is, we're going to need 4 more planets to provide for those resources. And again, we don't have 4 more planets. So there has to be a balance between consumption and the human population, which is going to require us rethinking our current technologies and continue to look for future technologies that are going to be more environmentally friendly. At the end of chapter 1, we talked about the idea of not in my backyard. Yeah, I want to do things for the environment. I just don't want to see a landfill in my backyard. I don't want to see a solar farm in my backyard. Well, in the past, how we've dealt with that is the people that don't want things in their backyard tend to have the money or the influence. And so where do these things get built? They get built in the backyards of low-income communities or areas that are dominated by minority groups that don't have maybe the same political pull that the more wealthy people do. This whole process is called environmental justice. The idea that every person has the right to adequate protection from environmental hazards. It's not fair that dumps or nuclear power plants get built only in low-income neighborhoods. These people also tend to have less access to health care because they have less money. And so it's an important concept moving into the future that we consider the rights of the poor or ethnic minorities to not be less than the rights of the rich and powerful people. A concept tied to this is eco-justice, that links the social and environmental ethics concepts together to find ways of addressing this trend that low-income communities have more exposure to environmental toxins because that's where we build the chemical plants, that's where we build the hazardous waste facilities, that's where we build the nuclear power plants and the coal-burning power plants. So these communities get higher exposure to environmental pollutants, and again, they have less health care to be able to address those health problems. So the more problems there are, the less they're able to address those problems. So we need to realize that it's the right of every citizen to be protected equally from environmental hazards. And again, to move away from this past practice of building these things only where the people didn't have the ability to fight it. A fellow named Lester Brown in 2006 came up with this plan and basically came up with 5 recommendations for sustainable living on into the future. Number 1 was to eliminate poverty and stabilize the human population. So we've talked a little bit about that already. To protect and restore the Earth's resources, not just to protect them from future damage, but fix past damage that we've caused as humans to our resources. Number 3, to provide adequate food to all people. Number 4, to mitigate or fix the impacts that climate change are having or might have in the future on our planet. And again, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, because most of us live in cities now, design sustainable cities where they're not sinks for resources. They are, they're benefiting the environment, not damaging the environment. These are all topics we're going to cover in a lot more detail in this class. Again, it's pretty simple, a dozen words or so. We just eliminate poverty, and we stabilize human population, we protect the Earth's resources, we give everybody equal access to food, healthcare, that kind of stuff. We fix the damage we've already done. Sounds pretty straightforward, but again, it's not something we're going to be able to fix overnight. Complex problems, which all environmental problems are, cannot be fixed with simple solutions. So how can we address these 5 things? How can we eliminate poverty and stabilize the human population? Well, the challenge, the reason that this hasn't already happened, in other words, why haven't we already fixed poverty, is because the resources on this planet are not equally distributed. Some countries have a lot of wood, other countries have none. Some countries have a lot of really good soil for growing food. Some countries don't have really great soil. So we don't have resources equally spread around the planet. Just one example. I read once where if you take all of the fresh water on the earth and you spread it equally across the dry land on the planet, there would be about 3 feet of water on the ground everywhere. Well, if the Sahara Desert had 3 feet of water a year, it wouldn't be a desert. If the tropical rainforests had 3 feet of water a year, they wouldn't be rainforests. So we know by default that some areas get more moisture than other areas. That can be good for growing food. Not enough rainfall can be bad for growing food. So that's not something we can exactly fix. We can get those resources to people that need them, but the fact is that those resources are not equally distributed. About 5% of the population in the world controls about a quarter of the resources. So it's a distribution challenge. Tens of thousands of children die each day in the world, in those less developed countries largely, just because they don't have vaccines that could keep them alive. They don't have a clean supply of water. They don't have enough food. So raising the standard of living of the world's poorest people by things like universal education, if they know more about things, they can help address those problems. By teaching those children, we're eliminating illiteracy, and then again, those children might be able to learn and develop new things that'll help their countries survive into the future. Simply improving the status of women, the social status or the economic status of women worldwide is a huge step into improving globally the world. And again, staying within the carrying capacity of the earth is ultimately the key thing here. By educating people, they can then be thinking about ways to fix these problems that we've created today. How do we protect and restore the Earth's resources? Well, forest logging is unsustainable in many places in the world. In the United States, it is a very sustainable process. We have the education, the knowledge, the ability to manage our forests very much sustainably. Whether or not you like clear cuts, those kinds of things, we'll talk more about that later. But forestry in developed countries is sustainable. However, again, that's not where most of the people live. Those developing countries, where their timber may be one of their only resources, they're not thinking sustainable. They're thinking sell as much as possible today so that we can buy stuff that we need for survival. They're not thinking about the future. They're thinking about the very near future, days, weeks, months, not years, decades, hundreds of years. And so in places across the world where forest management isn't sustainable, biodiversity is being affected. 5 out of every 6 species on the planet haven't even been found yet. Now, most of these are insects and small things that live in very remote places in the world. But those are exactly the places I was just talking about, where harvesting vegetation and growing food is their number one priority, not preserving biodiversity. 80% of the species that we depend on for food, for medicines, those kinds of things, are in these developing countries. So the more that they exploit their resources to sell them to us, the less ability we have in the future to maybe find that cure for cancer or the next food item that's going to help us address hunger in the world. Natural environments provide a huge diversity of ecosystem services. These are things like providing us with food, medicine, energy, building materials, clothing, just places to go recreate, to enjoy ourselves, to get away from stresses of work, but also very important services like protecting watersheds, providing us with good soil that we can grow food on, keeping our climate stable instead of some of the changes we're seeing today. And again, just providing habitat for all of the living things on this planet, including us. Something that we probably don't think much about. Biological diversity, how many different living things there are, is very much related to cultural diversity. With all the different languages and traditions across the world, all of those things have been impacted by the environments we live in. So the only reason that we have such a wide variety of cultures on this planet is because we have such a wide variety of habitats on this planet. And so if we're threatening the habitats, which we are, we're also threatening the cultures of some of these people. And again, when those things are gone, they're gone. Just like when the last drop of oil gets pumped out of the ground, it's pretty much gone forever. If we destroy cultures worldwide, they're pretty much gone forever. And they're all part of our heritage as humans. Who we are, what we are, is all because of that diversity that we have. So food insecurity is a huge issue that we have to address. Lack of access to food needed to live healthy, productive lives is important. Again, there are 800 million people worldwide that live in hunger, malnutrition, and most of these are in rural areas in developing countries, places where those people only have the ability to provide the food they need for themselves, but not with enough money to buy other things they might need. So certainly the way that we've been able to support our growth is by improving our agricultural practices to be sustainable. We grow multiple crops in a given year. We do conservation tillage. We grow our own fish out in the ocean. All of these things we'll talk about more detail later on. But basically, for these less developed countries to continue providing enough food for their people, they're going to have to continue to develop these agricultural practices to be truly sustainable. Let's look at food volatility in the last 10 or so years. If we go all the way back to 1975 until the end of the last century, 2000, the production of food, or actually I guess the food prices, have declined. So again, the graph you can see there, based on a food price index, the overall price of food, which is adjusted for inflation. So even though a price may go up, if the average wage goes up even more, then relatively speaking, the price of that food item goes down. But if we go back just the last 10 years, food prices have been increasing and have been less predictable. So the trend of prices decreasing in the past 25 years now has been reversed with an increase. And so think about what type of relationship this graph suggests between the price of food and energy. Does it take energy to grow food? Yes, right? Tractors to plant it, machinery to harvest it, trucks to get it from where it's grown to where it's packaged, trucks to get it from where it's packaged to where it's sold, and then you driving a vehicle to that grocery store to buy food and bring it home. So if prices of energy have been increasing, that's pretty clearly one of the main reasons why the price of food has been increasing. The market for fossil fuels like petroleum has been a lot more volatile in the past 10 or so years. And so that's really one main reason why food prices have been so volatile. Another one of those items was mitigating climate change. So the greenhouse effect that we're seeing now is basically caused by all the gases that we're throwing up into the atmosphere, which are largely caused by humans. If we look at the change, it's mostly happened since about 1975. That's when the most dramatic changes have occurred. We've had precipitation patterns changing dramatically since then. More drought years like we're seeing right now in the western U.S. So we're going to need a very comprehensive energy plan to help stabilize the climate into the future. It has to start with cutting carbon emissions, which again, primarily things like automobiles are responsible for. And as I mentioned earlier in Chapter 1, we're going to have to find a way sooner than later to phase out fossil fuels, getting away from burning petroleum products to using things like solar power that we see in this image on the slide. And then continue, we've made a lot of progress, but continue to improve energy efficiency. Again, fairly easy to say, but in practice, it's going to have to come with a cost. It won't be free to make things more efficient. It won't be free to switch from fossil fuels to other types of energy. Your book also indicates that there isn't a real direct cause and effect relationship between the increase in CO2 and climate change. It's more of a cascade effect of interactions in the environment. Increasing CO2 may cause a cascade of interaction responses throughout the planet. The example on the right shows one relationship between ocean acidity and how that affects coral reefs being bleached out at an increasing rate, and how that affects the ocean's food webs, and how that is going to relate to a greater level of extinction over time, extinction of those living things in the earth. But terrestrial systems, dry land areas, are also going to be affected because of changing precipitation and warming or cooling. If the planet gets a little warmer, a little bit drier, areas that have recently historically been snow are going to melt and become liquid. If the tundras melt, if the ice caps melt, then those ecosystems are going to change because the animals and plants in those ecosystems were adapted to those specific conditions, not warmer conditions that might be seen if that continues to happen. And then in turn, the living systems in the ocean will be impacted, and in turn, ultimately, it's going to impact us as humans. So we have to really look at where do our activities fit into this diagram. And I would probably argue, if you look through this diagram, that we're kind of all in this diagram, just about everywhere. Things that we do have at least the potential to have impacts throughout this diagram here. The other item, I think the fifth item, was designing sustainable cities. With, again, half of the world's population living in cities, And in the US, it's even higher. About 80% live in cities. We have to continue to make our cities more livable. And again, addressing those problems, making transportation more effective in cities so that we're not all dependent around cars. Right now, if you really look at our cities, they are built around cars, not around people. It pretty much makes it dependent that we have to use cars to get around. Now, there are some exceptions, even on a small scale maybe. New York, although it has huge amounts of traffic, it has a better infrastructure, subways, buses, those kinds of things. But most U.S. cities are still built around cars, not around people. So anytime we're dependent on automobiles, we're going to continue to create a lot of carbon dioxide emissions. And so we have to reduce these emissions by changing the fundamental way that our automobiles work. Again, instead of burning fossil fuel, they need to be electric, and they need to be things like hydrogen powered. And again, we'll talk more about that later. When we have a large concentrated population, whether it's people or animals, they generate a lot of waste. So how is that waste treated? Well, we're going to continue to need to improve the way we recycle our waste products or treat them so that when they're released into the environment, they're safe for the environment. And again, it's like anything in nature. If there are too many things living in a small area, they can destroy the environment they live in, making it impossible for even them to continue living. And that's no different with the human population. We are, as humans, just like any other living thing on this planet. We're held to the same sort of environmental laws. Too many people in too small of a space, using too many resources, means we have the greatest potential to damage that environment to the point where we can't live in it any longer. So the chapter ends with a case study, the Los Plateau in China. It's a semi-arid area, as you can probably tell from looking at the image, kind of dryish, not a lot of vegetation. And basically because of centuries of cutting trees down and grazing too many animals, it's turned the area into a very unproductive, deserty type of area. Prior to this exploitation of the environment, it was a fertile soil that was very good for growing food. And it was an important resource for China for growing food that fed those people. Again, you can see what it looks like now, but you can also read what they're expecting for the future. There's hope. The Watershed Rehabilitation Project has been in the works now for about 20 years, planting trees, terracing the landscape to minimize soil loss. And given time, the area can rebuild its soil, can be productive again. And then as long as they continue to utilize that in a conservation-minded way, that area can be that productive once again. But it was humans that caused the problem, and it has to be humans that can solve the problem. And again, you'll see that is also a very common theme as we continue through this class.